Hey everybody, and welcome to Yesterday's Coffee with myself, Jody Carlton of Autism Advisory Services. That's autismadvisory.com. Wherever you are in your autism journey, I'll meet you right there. Hey everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Yesterday's Coffee. So I thought I'd start and let you guys in on why I decided to call this podcast Yesterday's Coffee. And really it goes back to kind of a joke that I've had, a running joke I've had for a while with my husband, because sometimes life just gets so busy around our household that we've just not had time to brew a fresh pot in the mornings, and there's a little bit left over from yesterday, and we've been known to just heat up a little bit that's left over in the pot, stick it in the microwave, and slap a little cream and sugar in there, and that's my cup of coffee for the morning while I'm waiting on a fresh pot to brew, or sometimes even if I didn't have time to brew a fresh pot. And we've laughed before and said that sounds like a good name for a podcast or even a blog, because sometimes life just gets so busy sometimes, especially for us families who have autism spectrum disorders or other types of special needs, because there have been times, mornings when it's 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon before I even realize I didn't have lunch, or there have been days when I didn't even realize that I didn't even have lunch, because life just keeps on going and it doesn't even stop for me sometimes. And I know that you guys can relate to that. So I'm just really excited about my podcast, and Yesterday's Coffee just seemed like the perfect name for it. So welcome. And my goal for this podcast is to have it out for you, have a fresh episode out for you guys once a week. And that may be a lofty goal, or I may be able to get you episodes more often than that. I don't know. We'll see what happens. My thoughts are to share a little bit of my life with you, my personal life with you, with my own family, but also just to reflect on my thoughts about some of the experiences that I hear from you guys through my consulting practice, because I hear a lot of things. I've heard a lot of things over the years as I worked as a counselor a few years ago when I was working with families with autism spectrum disorders. And as you all know, I've recently launched a consulting practice where I'm going to be working with you guys again, and I'm so excited about that. And I've been hearing from you through my Aspie Spot blog and organization for the last year and a half as well. So Yesterday's Coffee, this podcast is really for me to just reflect and kind of share with you my thoughts. So I hope you enjoy it. So my thought of today was to kind of take you back in time to when things kind of started for me and for my family, when we first found out we were going to be an autism family. And really, it goes back to well before we realized we were going to be an autism family. And I think that this is probably the case for many of you as well. My daughter Abby, who is now 13, she just turned 13 a few weeks ago. So I have a teenager now. Oh, scary times. She was first diagnosed with autism, which at the time was called pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, which is a mouthful. It was abbreviated as PDD-NOS. When she was 5 years old, and at that time, that was one of the first diagnoses a child would get before they were diagnosed with either autistic disorder or Asperger's disorder. And she was 5. She was in kindergarten, and she received that diagnosis from the Vanderbilt University at the Autism Research Institute. I believe it was. I'm having to think and remember. I, like many of you, have lost some brain cells over the years, but it was the Kennedy Autism Research Institute, I believe, is the name of it. I will have to go back and look that up for you and maybe edit that in afterwards. But anyway, it was at Vanderbilt. And we had suspected, excuse me, spectrum disorder because I went to a counseling workshop about autism. It was actually at an autism conference for any kind of healthcare provider, really. But I went to get a continuing education credit for my counseling license. And I specifically went to this autism conference because I was wondering if she might be on the spectrum. But she had had developmental delays for quite some time. She was 5, and Abby had been diagnosed with developmental delays as early as she was around 7 months of age when she was first diagnosed with developmental delays. And I had we knew to look for these problems in her because I had actually had a virus while I was pregnant with her. In my last trimester, I was around 28 weeks when I came down with a virus that really felt like a horrible case of the flu. But they tested me for a few different things, including Epstein-Barr, which is the virus that causes mononucleosis. But I tested positive for something called cytomegalovirus. Say that 3 times fast. I'd never heard of it. It's abbreviated as CMV. And it's a megavirus. It's a pretty big, bad virus that can cause major birth defects and problems for an unborn child if they contract it from their mother in utero before they're born. And Abby did get it from me. They tested her for it when she was born, and she tested positive for it. But she was what they called asymptomatic when she was born. She didn't have any obvious symptoms at birth, but we knew she might develop issues later on, and she did. And really, she had more symptoms earlier on than we even realized. For example, she had trouble latching when she was trying to nurse early on, and she had a lot of trouble feeding, nursing, and just slowly started falling behind developmentally. And then by the time she was 7 months old, she was really far behind. I think the early intervention specialists came in and tested her, and by the time she was 8 months old or so, she was 4 to 6 months behind developmentally. So she was pretty far behind. And we really, at that point in time, nobody really mentioned autism. Well, she was a baby. Nobody mentions autism at that age. We just thought it was the CMV bug, and that was the culprit. But fortunately for us, we got a lot of early intervention services here in the state of Georgia. We had very good funding in our state at that time, and she received occupational therapy and speech therapy and physical therapy, and we even had someone called a special instructor. And all of these people actually came into our home once or twice a week and delivered services to us. And our occupational therapist at the time was the first person who introduced me to something called sensory processing disorder, which is one of the main symptoms of autism spectrum disorders. And I had never heard of this, and it was a huge part of Abby's difficulties. And Abby's treatment for this sensory issues. We still laugh to this day how, as Abby got older, she continued to receive these services off and on through her even early elementary school years. But she would, as she saw her OT, her occupational therapist, coming to the door, her name was Cheryl, and Abby would look out the door and say, "Bye bye, Miss Cheryl," because she hated to see her coming. Because she really didn't enjoy the therapy at all, but it was very good for her. Um, she it helped her learn how to deal with sensation and movement, and it helped her body learn how to deal with what it was perceiving, what her senses were perceiving. But those early intervention therapies that our state funded for us were crucial, and I to this day attribute so much to those early intervention treatments, in reference to how high functioning my daughter is today. So many people now say, oh, they have no idea she has autism, has Asperger's. And I just really strongly feel that early intervention was the key to that. And it's so sad to me. Our state has lost a lot of the funding that it had during those years. And it saddens me because I know a lot of the children in my state are not receiving those services the way we did. We do still have early intervention here, but not nearly to the level and to the degree that we had it. And that saddens me tremendously. And so part of what I want to do is to help families access those services in other ways, through private insurance or grant funding or some other way through the school systems, even though the schools are limited significantly in terms of what they can provide. But even through learning what you can do at home in terms of providing a sensory diet, which is a strange sounding word. And when I say diet, I'm not referring to food. I'm referring to activities and sensory input that you can provide for your child at home. And you can learn through books and videos how to do this for your child at home. And so I want to help families learn how to do those things for their children at home while these children are still very young and developing. So Abby received those services as a very young child, and then went on to eventually receive her official autism diagnosis when she was 5. And then there was a year when she was without services, when one particular school system, when we moved to a different county, didn't seem to think she qualified for services. There are always school systems that aren't cooperative. And so she did not receive any kind of support services in the school system during her kindergarten year, even though she was diagnosed with autism that year privately, and we provided those reports to the school system. They just didn't think that Vanderbilt knew what they were talking about. But we moved to a different county the following year, and the very first week of school, her first grade teacher called me and said, we're going to need an IEP. So that school system was very cooperative and very eager to provide her with the services that she needed. And I was thrilled to hear that. And I encourage all parents to welcome services if a school is willing to provide them. So many parents are worried about a stigma and worried about a label. And I've never been that parent. I have always been the parent that says, bring it on. If you're willing to provide my child with services and supports, give it, bring it, because it's only going to help her. And it really has helped Abby being able to pull out and be in small groups and have longer test time. It's really helped her. And actually, she now no longer needs them anymore. And I believe that it's because she had them when she needed them. So don't worry about that label. That's my philosophy. Don't worry about the label. Don't worry about the stigma. If your child needs the services, get your child the services, especially if you have a school that is willing to provide it, because so many school systems are not cooperative, and there are parents who are struggling and fighting to get the services that their child needs. Then Abbie went on to actually get an Asperger's diagnosis around the time she was 8. Excuse me. And of course now that diagnosis is irrelevant, because in 2013, the American Psychiatric Association actually removed that diagnosis from the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, the DSM-5. That doesn't mean that Asperger's doesn't still exist as somewhat of a separate category. There are a lot of people who had previously been diagnosed with Asperger's who are very upset about that change. And Abbie is one of those people. She's extremely upset about that. She calls herself an Aspie, which is a term that many with Asperger's affectionately use to refer to themselves. So most of those folks refer to themselves now as having high-functioning autism. But that's a whole nother podcast, which I'll probably do. But anyway, that's kind of our backstory in a very fast nutshell, that I wanted to kind of share with you my background. And I also don't want to leave my little guy out. I also have a son who's 9, about to be 10, and he should get a little bit of press too, because when he was a baby, when he's 3 years younger than Abbie, he was actually he began to have seizures when he was about a little less than 2 years old. And we thought, well, good grief, what in the world? He was supposed to be my healthy child. You know, we thought that CMV had been Abbie's culprit, and maybe even the trigger that was the environmental trigger that I don't know, triggered the autism gene, if you will. The genetic influence, the environmental influence. But we thought Aiden was going to be our healthy kid, and all of a sudden he started having seizures. And Abbie does not have seizures. A lot of kids with autism do. She does not. And it was a very stressful time in our lives, having a 4 or 5 year old with autism, and then a not even 2-year-old having seizures, and not really knowing what was going on. And he was diagnosed with epilepsy at the time, idiopathic epilepsy, meaning they didn't really know why. There was no brain tumor, nothing they could find. And they never really did figure out why. And he still, to this day, is considered to have epilepsy, although he really doesn't have seizures much anymore, unless he recently had a recurrence where he got really sick for several weeks, just getting infections and viruses one after the other, and it just lowered his seizure threshold, and he ended up having a breakthrough seizure. But he also went on to be diagnosed with sensory processing disorder, and has had to be in and out of occupational therapy for many years. And he's also had to have speech therapy for articulation delays in his speech. And he also has been diagnosed with auditory processing disorder. So he has been evaluated and is not on the autism spectrum, but he has many other of the sensory processing issues that kids on the spectrum have. And this is something we really see very, very often among families that have autism spectrum disorders. A lot of times we see multiple children on the autism spectrum. And if not multiple children on the spectrum, a lot of times other children in the family will have sensory disorders. And oftentimes parents will realize that they are quite possibly on the autism spectrum. Oftentimes there are parents that when their children are evaluated for autism, they realize that they share many of the traits with their children. many of the autistic traits and also many of the sensory traits. So anyway, that's kind of my family in a nutshell, and I hope that kind of sheds some light for you on me and my background, and makes you feel a little bit more connected with me. If you're interested in listening more to Yesterday's Coffee, or even interested in any of my other consulting services or some of the courses that are going to be available here soon online. So if you have any questions or thoughts and want to reach out to me via email, please do so. Otherwise, I hope you look forward to the next episode of Yesterday's Coffee. Thanks again for joining me for the first episode of Yesterday's Coffee. Be sure to come on over to the website at autismadvisory.com to take a look around and schedule an appointment for a consultation session if you're interested. Stay tuned for the episode 2, where we're going to talk about that moment in time when we realize that our child may have autism. I'm going to tell you about mine. See you next time.